Welcome to Chapter by Chapter. I am your host, Brian Thomas Kropp, and I believe that stories have a tremendous power for good, and so I write them, and I enjoy sharing them with you. And if you are new to the podcast, I'm glad that you are here. We have been in a story that I wrote a while ago called Shell Game, and it is part 2 of a series of books that we are in the middle of, well, both reading and writing, I suppose, called the Pearl Saga. You can, in just a little bit, you'll hear an ad for Showdown in the Yukon, which is part 1, and then we are reading part 2. I'm in the middle of writing part 3. Several weeks ago, I've sort of been moaning that there is a chapter in the third book that yet has no title that I was really dreading writing. Well, good news is I finally got past that chapter, and so that is good. Took a little bit of a break for summer vacation and those kinds of things, and I have gotten past that one and have now made further progress. So I think as far as rough drafts go, I am almost halfway through that first draft, and then the difficult work of going back through and making sense out of it. I heard a quote about drafts at some point somewhere that said you write the first draft for yourself, and then you write every subsequent draft in order to make it seem like everything was done on purpose. So I know I'm writing a bunch of stuff. I'm going to have to fix this. I'm going to have to fix that and all this kind of stuff, which is partly disheartening, but partly like I just got to get it out and write it down, and then you can kind of massage the bits and pieces around. But so that's where we are with the Pearl Saga. Where we are in this particular story of Shell Game, we've been following a detective named Evan Gold who works in a small Kansas town named Athens, Kansas. And he's kind of gotten himself in a bit of a mess. He has a wife who's about to leave him, a business that's about to fold, and he's got this client who is being less than forthcoming with truth about a variety of things. And there's also been a discovery of this pearl that Evan has possession of, but a lot of people are trying to get, and he's trying to figure out, is there any connection between the pearl, his client, all these strangers that are suddenly showing up in town, and there have been a couple of murders in town, and does the pearl and these people have any connection with that? So he's trying to figure out where everybody is in the stuff. And so he and his client are trying to get together with this third character named Harold Huber and trying to find him in town so they can have a conversation. And as a good friend of mine likes to say, let's just get all the liars in the room and find out what the truth is. So that is what is coming up for Chapter 19. That's all the setup for that. But we will get to that and then get to some discussion about that chapter on the other side right after we hear from this week's sponsors. Chapter 19. Who was that woman? Claire asked as Evan took her by the arm. Evan was unable to speak and clenched his jaw. He led Claire up one flight of stairs, ignoring the eyes peeping through the crack in Mrs. Logan's door. Evan unlocked his door, reached around to pop on the lights before allowing Claire to step through the doorway. Once he was through, Evan closed and locked the door behind him. All the while, he chewed his teeth and tried to get his temper back under control. It mystified him why he could take all kinds of abuse from cops and clients alike, but Catherine knew just how to jab where it hurt most. Claire spun around, making a quick assessment of the Spartan furnishings. Her eyes finally landed back on Evan. She stared at him with pity. Did she get you flustered? Is she someone I need to worry about? Evan looked up at Claire, smiled, took off his hat, and tossed it on the lonely table by the kitchen. Nah, she's not someone you want to take your eye off of, that's for sure, but I think as far as you're concerned, she's playing in a different ballpark than you. It's just, when I see you get rattled. Claire stopped. I'm used to you being a rock, a figure of granite. I feel so safe with you. There's been so much happening over the last couple of days. My nerves are at an absolute frazzle. Which reminds me, Evan said, raking his hair with his hands as he walked over to the phone. He picked up the glossy black handle in one hand and dialed the phone number for the Webster Hotel with the other. One ring, Evan smoothed back down his hair. 2 rings. The Webster picked up. Yes, said Evan. I'm looking for a guest of yours, Mr. Harold Huber. Uh-huh. Yes. He isn't, huh? Interesting. Evan glanced at his watch. Well, could you leave a message? Yes, have him call Evan Gold when he gets in. No, he has my number. Thanks so much. Evan hung up. While he was on the phone, Claire perched herself in the crook of the sofa, her slender legs tucked up under her. As for Evan, he unbuttoned his coat, slunk down in a nearby armchair, and closed his eyes. We're waiting? Claire asked. We're waiting, Evan mumbled. A silence fell over the room. Evan started to feel the pressure lift from his mind. I think this is where we make idle small talk, she said eventually. Is it? Well, sure. I don't know much about you. You don't know much about me. I mean, I like what I know, but I'm certain there are layers, more movement below the surface. I'm afraid whatever you found is going to disappoint you. Claire adjusted herself on the sofa. What got you into the detective business, Evan? Claire asked. That's not a very interesting story, Evan said. You might as well ask me why the sky is blue or why the waves only come up so high on the shore. What's that supposed to mean? Claire straightened up a little. Let me guess. Her eyes narrowed as if she were peering into his mind. Your father was a cop. Or no. Your father passed when you were still a boy, and you were the only one left to protect your mother. Well, you'd be wrong on both counts, Evan remarked. Yeah, Claire said. What's that they say about appearances? They aren't all they seem, Evan smiled. Is that what they say? Claire said. Evan opened his eyes and looked at his client. You want to know my story? Okay, here goes. Years ago, Evan began, I was talking to a detective friend from back in Vermont. He tells me of a man, roughly the age I am now, wife, kids, the works, takes off missing. That, of course, may not be so hard to imagine. I don't know how you feel about settling down with rugrats of your own, but since you're an attractive person who hasn't settled down, I'm guessing you could understand the man's plight. Anyway, the Vermont man gets a letter in the mail. It's from a law firm in Rhode Island. The letter informs him your blah 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 died and left you a lot of money. This, of course, is excellent news. He receives the inheritance, pays off all his creditors, sets up funds for each kid, and buys the wife a new up-to-date house. Everything's peach fuzz. Then, as one might guess, our man takes ill. Doctor gives him 6 months and tells him to get his affairs in order. The family's beside itself. Each day seemed like one less drop available in the cup of life. Our man is so overwhelmed, so racked with lament, that he is hospitalized in less than 2 months. Seems he went in as much for distress as for the disease eating him from the inside. Evan looked over to Claire. She leaned forward on her elbow, quite interested in the details of the story. The look on her face also asked what this story had to do with her question. Evan chuckled and continued. As you know, hospitals aren't so much a place to get better, but a place where the dying are made more comfortable. This fact was certainly true in the Vermont man's case. Day after day, our man gets worse and worse. Eventually, the wife can't take the strain and stops coming to see him. It's all very ugly. But then, one night, no one knows why, but then the treatment finally takes. Day by day, he gets better and better. After 3 weeks in the hospital bed, he's able to go home, walks out on his own 2 legs. He makes it to the day 6 months after the original diagnosis, and he's feeling as good as he'd ever felt in his life. Then, something clicks in his mind. He goes to work one day and never comes home. He died? Evan frowned and shook his head. Nah, he just left. Poof. Left town. Just like that? Claire asked with saucer-sized eyes. Just like that, Evan said and snapped his fingers. The telephone rang at the exact moment that Evan snapped, almost as if it had been a prearranged effect. Evan moved to pick up the call. So what happened? Claire asked. Hello? Evan said into the receiver, then smiled. Harold! Good of you to call. Yes, I was wondering if I could meet with you at my place. When? Now. I'm sure it is. I'm sure you do, but see, I have Claire Porter with me, and I thought you two might... Yes, I thought that would change your mind. We're at 2 South Cottonwood, Apartment G. I'll ring you up when you get here. Evan returned the receiver. Harold's on his way. Seems you're quite the draw. Now we might be able to make some headway on whether or not anyone is trying to harm you. Evan moved to look out the window. Oh, I'm quite sure there is, Claire said. What was that? Evan said, not turning his head. The blonde in the trench coat was still keeping vigil by the streetlight. Evan? Claire said. Uh-huh, he mumbled. What happened to the man? You've got me on pins, Claire asked, now up on her knees looking over the back of the sofa. The man? Evan turned back to her. Oh, in Vermont? Years later, the daughter of the man, now full grown, hires my friend. Tells him some line, much like the story you fed Gabe and me. Maybe that's what put it in my mind. Daughter says she's heard reports of her father living in the woods near Massachusetts. My friend checks out the story. Turns out she's right. It's her father. What was he doing out there? Asked Claire. Seems that hospital visit did a real number on his perspective. For years he'd worked and worked, but the only thing he had to show for all of his labor was stress. He hits a windfall, and though the money stress left, it didn't save him from the sickness. As he left the hospital, he concludes that he's experienced a miracle, a gift, if you will, randomly and deservedly given. He wasn't going to blow this second chance. This was a wake-up call. He concluded that he should live life. However, he didn't want to worry about the consequences of family and other responsibilities, so he cut ties with everything he knew and loved because life is a random roulette wheel. With that, Evan sat back down in the armchair. The moral of that story is this. You asked why I became a detective. The moral is, people do what makes sense to them, even if it doesn't make a lick of sense to anyone else. Oh, Evan, I don't like that story, Claire said. I don't like it one bit. I mean, you don't think that way, do you? Don't you think things happen for a reason? I don't know, to be frank. Doesn't much matter what I think, though. Things are going to happen with or without a reason. I'm just along for the ride. Claire swung her feet to the floor. I mean, think of you and me. There are how many towns I could have come to? There are how many detective offices I could have called on? But I ended up in this town and at your office. Yeah, but there's not that many detectives in Athens. Besides, let's not forget that 2 men are also dead, possibly because you came to this town. We must look at both sides of the coin, Evan said. What I mean is, Claire walked to his armrest and knelt, is that you and me, we could really be something, don't you think? Don't get me wrong, Evan said, looking into her soft eyes. I think you're a real nice girl in different circumstances and all that. Who knows? But 2 things I know. First, we've only known each other for 2 days. That's not a whole lot to build on. Stick with me and I'm sure you'll find a lot of things you'll find irritating. Second, you hired me to do a job. I'm just like a working-class schlub you hired to fix your wiring. I'm not a white knight. I'm probably never going to save the day. It's probably best you think of me just like that and not confuse things. I think you're too hard on yourself. You certainly tend to see the half-empty glass, Claire said. After this is all over, no. I try to see the water that's there. I don't try to judge the glass. After this is all over is a different thing than right now, Evan said. I mean, you seem like a nice enough person. If you can get away from whatever you think is chasing you, who knows? You might experience a personal miracle and your perspective could radically change. Claire's eyes pleaded with Evan, and her lips parted as if she was about to say one more thing when the doorbell buzzed. Evan raised his eyebrows and said, Ah, our guest has arrived. So this chapter provides a particular conundrum. I think I mentioned in a previous episode of the podcast that, actually so far in the whole history of the chapter-by-chapter podcast has been sort of me describing, in some regards, how I have been trying to grow as a writer. And it starts way back with sort of this burst of inspiration that I had once that wrote down the very first story that I think is in episode 2 of For the Benefit of Mr. Kite. And then with each subsequent book, I'm trying to work out a different, trying to grow, I guess, in a different way, whether it's writing longer or writing in a series or any number of things. And one of the issues that I had run into with writing a novel, because this idea of what to do with this pearl had been chewing around in my mind for a better part of a decade or two. What do I do with that? And since I don't have the ability right now to make a movie or a play or anything like that, it seemed like a book was the best way to go. So how do you write a novel? And one of the ideas had been, well, take an existing plot, mess with it a little bit, and then go from there. And that's what I had done with the first book, was showdown in the Yukon, and kind of templated off of the adventure story that Tolkien put into The Hobbit. And with this one, I said, well, I can't just keep doing that. I can't just take one whole story and template that. So with this one, I'm taking 2 different plots that I enjoy and kind of mashing them together. But one of them is the Maltese Falcon, which I referenced earlier. And there's this weird moment in at this point in the story in the Maltese Falcon where the detective, whose name is Sam Spade, he goes off on this odd story out of seemingly nowhere. It tells a story about this guy whose last name is Philcraft, and he kind of, it's weird. It's a weird story. It's similar to the one that Evan Gold tells Claire, but it's also very different, if that makes sense. There are similarities in that a guy sort of like picks up out of nowhere, like he has a regular life and then just decides to leave. That is similar, but a lot of things are different. And I remember reading Maltese Falcon, and I just thought, this really is filler. I read a web article recently that tried to suggest that it's a parable and it has deeper meaning, and that's lovely, but I can't find that in what I'm reading. So it does seem like, hey, we're sitting around waiting for somebody to return our phone call. What are we going to do? I don't have a plot device really, so I'll just have this detective go on a long-winded story. So what I wanted to do to improve it was to make the story have a purpose. That there's the question of why did you? I'm just making small talk. Everything that Claire is trying to do is to flirt with Evan to get some kind of advantage on him that way. And he's essentially using this story to stiff armor and say, I'm not playing whatever game that you're playing. I'm not playing that one. I'm playing a different game. And so it throws this long-winded story that really does seem to be relatively meaningless and absurdist or existential or something, and then land it with, you want to know why I became a cop? It's because people do what makes sense to them, which on one level reminds me of a story that I read in high school by the existentialist author, whose name is currently eluding me, but he's very famous in the existential world. He wrote a story called The Wall. He also wrote a tremendously interesting play called No Exit, but Bertolt Brecht is coming to mind, and I know that that's wrong. Anyway, this guy was French, not German. Doesn't matter. But he wrote the story about called The Wall, where it's some soldiers who are in a jail cell, and they are going to be executed by firing squad, thus The Wall. And one of them, like, you just watch them get stressed out about what's going to happen to them when they get executed. And one of them, at the last-ditch moment, says that he's going to confess and tell the cops where, I guess, the leader of the gang is or whatever. And he just sort of makes up a story, just sort of to buy time, but also, hey, if I'm going to die anyway, I might as well have a laugh out of it, as they have this wild goose chase. And it turns out that the story he told the cops was true, and that's exactly where the leader of the gang was. So he gets out free and doesn't have to get shot and all that kind of stuff. And it sort of has this absurdist, weird, like meaningless ending to it. But that is also where the Philcraft parable lands, and I wanted to make sure it had more of a point. People do what makes sense to them. There really is, even if you can't nail it down, everything that you do, you have a reason for. Even if it's just, I want it, or I think it's a good idea, you have a reason for it. And I have a pastor friend who is famous for also adding to that even crazy people who you would look at and they have lost touch with reality, they are still acting in what makes sense to them given their current mental state. So it really is just a long-winded way to say, back up, lady, you're not going to get in my head and know me and all those kinds of things. But it was kind of a fun exercise to see if I could at all improve what I feel like is a weird moment in the Maltese Falcon. So chapter 19 is sort of the second chapter in a long string of chapters that are essentially capturing what happens this evening in the life of Evan Gold. And it's several chapters long as several different things happen. And it kind of kicks off with Evan running into his wife outside his apartment, and then we're in the apartment for a little bit. And each chapter, unfortunately, sort of ends with these weird cliffhangers. And I remember listening or reading this to my family just to kind of get their take on it, and just getting into this rhythm of, oh, there's a knock at the door. Oh, the telephone rings. Oh, and we just kind of leave it there. I apologize in advance for the repetitiveness of how these chapters are going to end. That's sort of where we are. I am still learning and growing as a writer. And I think, going back and re-listening to the story, like, oh yeah, I could have shortened that up just a little bit. So it's a little bit of a learning exercise for me as well. I hope it is helpful for you if you're trying to figure out how to write stories, or just, I guess, how to analyze stories is another worthwhile pursuit as well. But that's it for the show today. I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you did, please go to wherever you're listening to this and leave the obligatory rating and or review. You can also swing by BrianThomasCrop.com and hop on my reader group. Just for the exchange of your email address, I'd be happy to send you several stories and chapters from other books that I think you might enjoy. Also, over there on the Amazon.com, you could leave a rating and review there for any of the books that I have written. And I think that's it. You have a great week, and I will see you back here next time.